Alrighty, everyone, we're going to get started here with our U.S. Bicycle Participation Study 2018 webinar. My name is Eric Rodell. I'm our Business and Political Engagement Manager here at PeopleForBikes, and I'm in the room with our own Jennifer Baldry, our Director of Research. So we're going to get started, and I'll hand things off to Jennifer.
Thanks so much, Eric. I'm going to make Eric sit here and listen, partly because this is such an awkward format for me. It's very weird right now to be able to see your audience. For those of you who don't attend webinars regularly, part of the weird thing about the webinar mode is that you can hear me, but I can't hear you. The webinar will be recorded. It'll be posted on our YouTube channel, and you'll be sent a link. So you're welcome to use that so you don't have to, take pictures or screenshots or whatever of the presentation as we go along. We are going to try to leave some time at the end for questions. So if you do have questions, please type them in the question box. We'll get to as many as we can during this presentation, and we'll follow up with you afterwards if we don't get to you. So with that, let's get started. Today we're going to talk about the results of our 2018 U.S. participation study. It turns out that measuring bike riding in the U.S. is not as straightforward or simple as I certainly would have thought prior to trying to do it. For those of you out there who do measure bike riding in some way, it's pretty tough. And part of the reason it's pretty tough is because bike riding takes so many forms. It's not just recreation, although it certainly can be. It's also for transportation, and it's one of the few activities we have that kind of overlaps both of those frames. So prior to 2014, there were sort of two distinct lines of existing research on bicycle participation. The first focused mostly on recreational riding. So the Physical Activity Council, National Sporting Goods Association, both conduct annual studies that measure how many days per year people participate in a bunch of different outdoor and other related activities, including bike riding. They measure road riding or paved riding. They measure riding on unpaved roads / mountain biking, and then BMX. So we do have trend data from that, but that part really leaves out a lot of the other type of riding that happens, and that's to get from one place to another. We do have a couple of lines of existing research that look like that. The American Community Survey measures the primary mode of transportation to and from work. Again, it's only transportation to and from work, and it's only the primary mode. So if you ride your bike to the bus and then take the bus the rest of the way, only the bus ride counts. So, that, although important and valuable because it's something we can measure over time, doesn't really cover all kinds of bicycling. We also have the National Household Transportation Survey, which measures more types of transportation riding, not just to and from work, but to other places as well. But that survey is only conducted about every 8 years. So it's really difficult to understand what's going on with bike riding, on a year-to-year basis even. So in 2014, PeopleForBikes commissioned the first bike participation study looking at all kinds of bike riding. Which was really the goal. The results we're going to talk about today are sort of the third in 4 steps of understanding the participation trend. But before we get to that, let's talk a little bit more about the methodology. It's nearly identical to the 2014 and 2016 studies. We're doing it every other year. So we have 14, 16, this is 18. We'll be able to talk about a trend line in 2020. It is a 10-minute online survey with adults 18 plus in the US. Parents report on their kids, so we end up with a total of about 21,896 individuals represented in our responses. The sample is weighted to represent the US population on key demographics. And bike riders, for the purposes of this presentation, are defined as anyone who rode a bicycle of any type outside for any reason at least one day in the last 12 months. That is actually a super important part because one of the differentiators of this study is that bike riding is defined really broadly. So, it's any type of bike riding outside for any reason. So it's not just transportation, it's not just recreation. It really is all kinds of bike riding outside, which it turns out with the advent of Zwift and other indoor riding technologies, we might have to rethink as we move forward. But in the meantime, bike riding outside. It also sets a broad cognitive framework. So I mentioned earlier the Physical Activity Council and the National Sporting Goods Association study. One of the difficulties there is they don't really exclude transportation riding, but because those bike riding, road riding, mountain biking, BMX are being asked in the context of a bunch of other recreation activities like skiing and jogging and hiking and camping. Certainly it sets a cognitive framework around, riding for fun or for recreation. In this case, for this study, bike riding is measured in the context of 10 activities, and there are activities that vary in terms of what type. Some of them, so we also do measure running or jogging, but we also measure things like doing homework or working at home. We measure things like drinking caffeine, watching TV, some things that are recreational, some things that aren't, things that we do a lot, things that we don't do very often. It's a wide mix of activities so that we're not setting people up to only think about bike riding in a kind of transportation or a recreation way. We also control for positive response bias. So what that means is in these online surveys, sometimes people will just say they do things so that they can continue in the survey, either because they want to feel good about themselves or they want to earn money for participating in the studies or things like that. I mean, there's lots of reasons why people might say things that aren't 100% true, but we control for that. We ask people whether they visited a fictional website, and if they have, we kick them out. We also kick out anyone who takes a really, really, quick amount, who completes a survey in a really small amount of time, because that's an indicator for us that they're not really paying attention to those questions. The other one piece that I want to point out is that we do also externally validate. So one of the things we ask in the survey is, how many times in the last 12 months have you read any type of book? The Pew Research Center also measures that on a regular basis, and so we can compare against the Pew and make sure we're in the ballpark. This year, the Pew estimated 74% of adults read a book. Our study estimates at 69%, so it's pretty close, enough that we think we're at least directionally in the ballpark. All right, before we get to the results, I want to talk a little bit about why we can't talk about a trend yet. We have 3 data points. It's really tempting to say, here were the results in 14, here are the results in 16, here are the results in 18, bike riding is up or down. We can't do that yet, and let me show you why. So these results are from the National Sporting Goods Association study. They also measure golf. If we were people for golf, we might be super excited about this, right? 2007 and we were back in time. Right? 2007 to 2008, it looked like many more people were participating in golf. We're doing a really good job. We're getting more people golfing more often. Pretty exciting. If we look at a longer trend line, what we see is that 2007 to 2008, there was a little blip there. The overall trend is really not that exciting. And I'm not at all saying that's happening with bicycling. I am saying that we need more than 3 points in time to really understand what the trend looks like. Even at 4 points, honestly, we'll have to be a little bit careful in the conclusions we draw, but I don't want to even look at a trend line until we have 4 points in time. Which means that our top line result, which I'll show you in just a minute, isn't the most exciting part of the study. What's most exciting is really what it tells us about what we can do to get more people on bikes. So the result for 2018, 32% of Americans ages 3 and up rode a bike at least one day in the last 12 months. That translates to about 98.3 million people. The percentage number is identical to 2016, but because of population growth, there's slightly more people riding bikes when you translate it out. The way that I talk about this until we have a trend line is that it supports the findings from the last 2 waves that we have about 1/3 of Americans riding bikes at least one time a year. And again, in 2020, next time when we have 4 waves of data, we'll talk more about the trend. In the meantime, as I said, the most exciting part is what the results can tell us about, what we can do to grow bicycling. How do we get more people on bikes? So the question we actually ask for all 10 of those activities I mentioned is, how many days in the last 12 months have you participated in this activity? And so we can look at, how often people say they're riding bikes. The one caveat I'd throw out here is that, if people are riding really infrequently, like 1 to 5 days, they're probably pretty accurate in their frequency. If they're riding a lot, like more than 100 days, there's a good chance they're tracking their ridership, and that's probably relatively accurate. The middle part is a little bit squishy. So although I broke it out by these granular kind of granular categories of ridership, I would say that what strikes me about this is that 34% of the people who say they ride bikes in the US are riding only 1 to 5 days a year. And even more if you look, 1 day a month or less often. And what that tells me is that one of our biggest opportunities for growing ridership is to get those people who aren't riding very often to ride more often. Not necessarily to get the people off the couch, but to get people who already have a bike and who are already doing it once in a while to do it more. At People for Bikes, we have a couple of different programs that are targeted just on that, and I'm just going to mention it really quickly and not go any further. But at the Sea Otter, just last week, we launched our Ride Spot program, which is specifically designed to help these infrequent riders connect with better rides that are recommended by people who know what they're talking about, and connect with other riders who like to ride just like they do. So, we're pretty excited about the opportunity to hopefully get people on their bikes more often using that Ride Spot app. And you can look on our website, just do a Google search for People for Bikes Ride Spot, and you can find out more information about that. The other thing I would say about this is that the results also suggest that most people who ride are riding at least sometimes for recreation. Only about 9% of the people who are riding bikes in the US ride exclusively for transportation. So there's also an opportunity to maybe get people to ride more often by showing people who are riding for fun how they might get to the coffee shop or to the movie theater or to their friend's house by bike, and then increase the kinds of riding people are doing as well as the frequency. And I think I already gave away the punchline on this one. Again, 55% of the people who ride bikes are riding only for recreation, growing that dark gray pie where people are doing both kinds of riding is an opportunity for us. And the focus on, the transportation riding, we often think about, bike to work day and things like that. Biking to work is a high barrier trip. People often have to carry things or bring kids. And 70%, according to this study, of those who ride for transportation are doing so to get to social and leisure activities like, going to the park or going to their friends or going to the community center or the movies or the museum. So those are really the best opportunities for getting people to consider the bike as a form of transportation. Now let's look at ridership by age group. And this is one, I think as an industry and at the Bicycle Leadership Conference that happened last week, we've certainly been talking a lot about. And that is, kids riding bikes. According to this study, 56% of kids ages 3 to 9 rode at least one day in the last 12 months. You might get excited about that. That's over half. That's a good thing. What I think about is, wow, only half. There's still half out there that we're not capturing. And we can see that bike riding sort of declines in general over age. If we could get that number up to 75, even if we didn't change the decline over time, we would be growing the ridership pie, the population of riders, a lot. And so, focusing on kids, I think really has a chance to move the needle. There are some great programs already out there like NICA and Little Bella's, Project Bike Tech, Trips for Kids, that are really working on this. And as People for Bikes, we're thinking really seriously about how to work on it as well. In fact, we're going to be talking with some of those super successful national groups in just a few weeks to figure out how we can help them, expand the level of their work and what we can do to contribute to the effort. When we look at the ridership by age, the biggest drop-off happens between right around driving age / college age. That dropped from 50% to 38%. Not super surprising. I mean, we live in a culture where, getting your driver's license is sort of a rite of passage. But I think about, what are the programs we could put in place, or where are the levers that we could to mitigate that drop off? Again, with the same idea, if we could even mitigate that drop off a little bit, then all the way through the rest of the lifespan, we would have a bigger participatory base. Colleges seem like a really good opportunity to do that. Kids, when they go to college, are changing their lifestyles in lots of ways. College campuses are often kind of big. There's not a lot of time between classes. The parking can be really expensive or difficult. those seem like a really good options for getting kids on bikes. And there are college campuses all over the country that are working really hard to do that with bike shares and bike libraries and things like that. The other major drop-off points happen kind of a little bit midlife, right? When people start to, maybe slow down and not ride so much. We see that drop by age 55. Only 18% of the US population is riding at least one day a year. Here, I think there are a couple of things. At People4Bikes, we talk a lot about how important it is to have great places to ride. We'll talk more about that in just a bit. But the other thing that I'm super excited about is e-bikes as a technology to extend the riding life cycle. Imagine what could happen if not only could we bump that 56% at age 3 to 9, but we could then also mitigate the trend, right? We could make sure that people get to ride longer, in their lives. And technologies like e-bikes show a lot of promise. Now we're going to move into some perceptions. So in addition to people telling us how often they ride and what kinds of riding they do, we do ask them how much they agree with a series of statements. The agreement is on a 1 to 5 scale, which is 1, not at all, and 5, I agree very much. The percentages here are the percentage of people who pick 4 or 5, which means that they agree with the statement. These two really struck me. So 48% of adult Americans think that the bike is a convenient way to get places, and 47% want to ride more often. And that's not even just bike riders. That's just adults 18 plus in the US. That's really exciting. What that tells me is that people really do want to ride more often. Then I look at some of the concerns people have. I worry about being hit by a motor vehicle. 50% of adults agree with that. I would be more likely to ride a bicycle if motor vehicles and bicycles were physically separated by a barrier. 43%. I feel more safe riding a bicycle now than I did 5 years ago. Only 17%. When I see that, it tells me a couple things. I think it provides some support for the emphasis we put on building complete connected bike networks that are safe from everyone from 8 to 80, right? Completely separated in most cases from traffic, except for, on streets with very low speed limits and not very many cars. We're working really hard on that in a lot of different ways, but creating safe places and comfortable places that are all connected for people to ride is a real key to growing ridership, and we need to do it faster. This is kind of the final data point I'm going to point out before we go to questions, and I think we'll have plenty of time for questions. I worry about my personal safety, and what that means is being mugged, being assaulted, being harassed, and that could be by other people in the community, it could be by police, it could be by a bunch of stuff. 36%, and that, over a third of adult Americans say they worry about their personal safety when riding a bike in their area. And I found that, pretty astounding. It feels like a big thing to have to take on, but if we really want to grow ridership, we need to be seriously thoughtful about what that means for the people who are out on the streets. Any of these questions can be broken down by demographics, and I wanted to show this one because what it shows me is that women, people of color, and people who live in urban areas are particularly concerned about that personal safety. And again, we talk a lot about how to diversify the participant base for bicycling. These are real concerns that we have to figure out how to mitigate, or we have to work with our city partners to figure out how to mitigate. But minimally, we need to at least bring them to the front and be talking about them because, they're serious concerns. Charles Brown, an academic at Rutgers, has done a bunch of work around biking while brown and biking while black that confirms these kinds of patterns in more qualitative research. Before we finish, this report, the data that I showed you today are only a really small sample of the potential opportunities. The full report is available on our website right now, peopleforbikes.org/participation. It's right there on the slide. You can go there, download the full report for free. It has the results for all the questions overall, and then it breaks all the results down by age, gender, region of the US, so that's west, south, etc. It breaks it down by area, urban, rural, suburban. All of those things are all broken out so you can take a look at much more detail in that full report online. And with that, I think we'll do questions. So the way this is going to work is Eric is going to read the questions for me, and then we'll go ahead and do our best to answer.
All right here from Wayne. Thank you very much. Will the slides be made available when finished? Yes, we will have a recording link sent out to all registrants for this webinar, and it will also be listed on our YouTube page. All right, and from Sean here. Is there any delineation of the recreational population into those involved with competition? Start with that one.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I really struggled because ultimately what I'd like to know, if this were a perfect world, I'd like to know how many people are riding, how often they're riding, not just days, but miles. I would also like to know, whether they're riding for transportation, what kinds of trips they're taking, also whether they're riding for recreation, and is that road riding or gravel riding or mountain biking. I would love to break all that out. The reality in survey research, and it's a reality that is frustrating all the time, is that we have to keep the surveys super short or else data quality suffers. And so we can't drill down into a lot of that stuff, unfortunately. USA Cycling, other major event sponsors across the country have a better sense of the trends in competition. We do look at that from time to time, and I'd love to be able to talk about, partnerships with event promoters around, can we put together stories around what's happening on the competitive side? All kinds of different competition, including grand fondos and things like that. So I'd love to know that. I don't really have that with this study.
And then a follow-up here. Any thoughts about working directly with scholastic-based programs such as those run by Specialized Foundation or Youth Educational Sports?
Yeah, that's also a great question. At the Bicycle Leadership Conference just last week, we had a draft panel that was specifically focused on youth participation. And some of that comes from we had USA BMX, and we had a bunch of others there, but we talked about the possibility of engaging education, engaging like actual schools and sort of things. NICA has done some of that too. There's actually a really great program in Washington that's been really successful getting bicycling into, I think, the second grade school curriculum. Don't quote me on that. I need to double check that that's true. It's second or third. It's definitely elementary school curriculum that's been very successful. And when we look at countries worldwide where bicycling is an everyday kind of part of life, the Netherlands, Denmark, cities in those kinds of countries, part of that is that bicycling is a required part of the elementary school curriculum. So I think there's a lot of promise there. It's a long-term solution that has a lot of heavy lifting to do, but I couldn't be more on board with moving in that direction.
All right, and then another one right here. Diane, thank you for your question. Have you done any research about the costs of riding a bike or an e-bike? 55 plus are often more able to purchase a bike.
That's a great question. And I'm going to frame it up in a couple of different ways. I would say, it depends on the comparison front, right? So for bike, there's a purchase cost, and you actually, can get a bike all along the range. E-bikes are pretty high range at this point, coming down some. But I think the real question is, what is the cost of purchase / ownership, particularly when we're talking about e-bikes that could be a car replacement versus the cost and ownership of a car as opposed to just by itself. I think it's all about the frame of reference. Certainly an e-bike can feel expensive when you think about the cost of a bike. It feels pretty inexpensive when you think about the cost of a car. And what we are seeing, we don't have a ton of data on e-bike ridership and use. We do have some, and we partnered with Portland State University to collect some data from e-bike riders and buyers. And they are, on an increasing level, using them as car replacement.
And that answers the next question here on the list of any idea what % of riders are using e-bikes?
Good question. Yeah, so this particular study, we are only asking about riding. We're not asking about the type of bike. And when we first designed the study in 2014, it was sort of before the big e-bike kind of push had started to happen. And so the reason we didn't include kind of bike is because mostly people don't really know, like mountain bike, road bike, transit fitness. It's really hard to describe those, the different kinds of bikes in a meaningful way. So we focus just on riding behavior. But e-bikes are pretty easy to distinguish. So that is something that we could add or could do differently. I will say that according to the BPSA sell-in data, e-bike sales are increasing at a 70+% rate year over year.
Which is huge.
Yeah.
And do we have any breakdown of responses by state?
Yeah, I so wish that we could not only break by state, but by city and even congressional district level, because that would be very valuable for us on a number of fronts. It's purely a cost issue in that, you have to have a certain number of responses before you can have a statistically valid sample. And we just don't have the funding to collect enough data to break it down at any level beyond the 4 US Census regions.
So we have a question here from Jim. The overall percentage of Americans hasn't changed year over year, but how about any other data points that you've shared? Are there any other major changes that you've discovered?
Yeah, great question. So we have, as I mentioned, we have a couple of other, ridership studies. The American Community Survey measuring, bicycle mode share has gone up. If you look over a long period of time, it's increased relatively steadily. We just got the 5-year estimates for 2017. There's always a year lag because of the data processing that goes on with that study. And for the first time, it actually went down a little bit. Again, 2 points don't make a trend. The overall trend for bike to work mode share is that it's increasing. But we'll have to see what happens in the next, few years. When we look, because the nice thing about that particular data point, the AC American Community Survey, bike to work mode share, is that we can actually break it down fairly granularly. So we can look at that at the city level. And there are cities, and mostly cities who've done a lot of investing in building really great bike networks, where bike to work mode share is increasing even in double digits year over year. So we are seeing on a local level a lot of growth on that front. But it's harder to see on a national level because the progress with better places to ride has been more piecemeal and local. For the Physical Activity Council study that measures recreational riding, in general, bicycling since 2010, and that's the point at which we can draw a trend line because they changed the methodology in 2010 to totally online. Bicycling is relatively stable. Road riding is down year over year about 1%. But mountain biking and BMX are both up. And so then we end up with a relatively stable growth. And keep in mind that mountain biking includes riding on unpaved surfaces. So I think we're maybe seeing, some road riders switch over to riding on dirt or gravel, potentially for safety concerns being part of it. But I would also hypothesize, and I don't have data on this, that it's an experience. I mean, when you ride on the gravel or dirt, you can ride 2 or 3 abreast and have a conversation, because you don't have so much to worry around the traffic.
And these are great questions, so we're going to keep it going here. And Colin asks, any insights on how bike ownership and bike usage correlate? With more bike share, are we seeing more non-bike owners and or new riders ride more often?
These are such great questions. And, they're all questions we talk about around here all the time. So there's the bike ownership and bike usage question, and that one's a little bit separate in some ways from the bike share. So what we do ask, and I didn't show the data in here, but we do ask in this participation study how many working operational adult bicycles are available in the home, and about 50% of adult Americans say they do not have access to an operational adult bicycle at home. Now that could mean that they have a bike in the garage and it has a flat tire and they don't know how to fix it, or a rusted chain or something like that. So I can't say that that's an ownership exactly. I mean, one of my big questions that I would love to answer for the industry is how many bikes are sitting in garages all over the country not being used, and what do we need to do to make those more accessible and useful for people? I think about mobile bike repair and the opportunities there to maybe get over some of those barriers. Bike share was the other piece. Mostly we're seeing bike share increase, especially over the last 5 years. If you look over a longer period of time, bike share is a relatively new arrival in US cities, and we've seen lots of uptake. We don't know a ton about whether those are new riders. The challenge there is that if people are bike share members, we can get more data and collect more data from them. But if they're just using bike share, there's no way to understand who they are or what they're doing. And so our knowledge on who's using bike share has been a little bit limited. And our knowledge around how that impacts purchase of new bicycles is purely anecdotal. We have no real data on that at all, and it's something that we're wondering about too. I hear, again, just anecdotally, we talk to a lot of retailers. I hear some retailers say, bike share has been great for me. They ride those big heavy bikes, and then pretty soon they're tired of them and they want to come in and get a much nicer bike, or they want to buy helmets or gloves or locks, or well, maybe not so much locks with bike share, but you get the idea. Other kinds of accessories. But I also have heard retailers say, bike share came to my town and my bike rental business, for example, really kind of dropped through the floor. So I think we don't really know at this point what the impact of bike share is on bike retail. And my guess is that it depends a lot on the context, the local context of the retail.
And it's 1:30 right now, but we only have 4 left. For those of you that can stick around, we can address these right now. And for those of you who can't, we will have them in the recording. Quickly, did you ask about helmet use?
We did not ask about helmet use.
What are 1 or 2 things that we can do immediately in our local markets to start moving the needle?
Yeah, I guess if I had to say, okay, you're a retailer, a local advocacy person, what is, the one thing I would really recommend? I think finding and focusing on these infrequent riders is sort of the best idea. So how do you find that? Well, if you're a local retailer, I think most retailers have some kind of point of sale system. You can look at your point of sale system and see, is there someone who bought a bike within the last year but hasn't been back in your store, or 2 years that hasn't been back in your store? Can you reach out to them and invite them to a group ride or something like that? Again, these are people that we know have shown some interest in bike riding, but we don't have evidence that they've continued to ride. And, I really think that's potentially the way to do it. And I'm going to give just one more really quick RideSpot pitch, which is, RideSpot is designed, and again, it's the app that we launched last week, really designed to help connect retailers with their customers. And the RideSpot app actually asks you to put in a bike, and then you're tracking your rides with the RideSpot app. And so the customers are tracking the miles on their bike. And if you host challenges, you can get access to some of that data. And that can also help you find those people that, maybe bought an entry-level road bike, but, maybe haven't been out on it, or at least not that you know of. So I guess that's the one sort of specific strategy I might throw out there as an opportunity.
And you can find that at ridespot.org. Just a few more here. Do you look at organized recreational events versus individual recreational riding?
Yeah, we're not really collecting any data with this study on organized rides at all, whether competitive or otherwise. We're really only asking about participation. It's something that I also think about. I mean, rides like RAGBRAI, and I think about like Dirty Kansas and Rebecca's Private Idaho. And those are, rides that are long and intensive. They're also rides that are attracting surprising new demographics, I think. I mean, Dirty Kansas, even though that's a super long ride, has just been, the registration, that's been crazy. Rebecca's Private Idaho boasts over 30% female ridership, which is pretty amazing for an event like that. And RAGBRAI sells out every year, and it's people who don't ride at all. It's a completely different demographic from, most of the organized rides we see. So Yeah, I think that can be a real sort of entry point for people, if we make those things accessible. And I would love to know more about what's going on with those organized rides.
How about any other insights into indoor spin classes?
Yeah, that's an awesome one. And it's so funny because I'm thinking about, of the things that I want to do more research on in the next year, indoor riding is for sure the top of the list. Again, Zwift, the virtual riding indoors. And there was a recent launch of a product, and I apologize to the company who created that product. I cannot remember the name of the company, and I'm looking at Eric because he's also a mountain biker, so he might know what it is. But it's essentially the mountain bike version of Zwift. And I think about what's going on with Peloton and with, all kinds of like indoor bike, there's one called Psychology or something like that, who's doing really well. Lifetime Fitness, has programs where they take, people who ride indoors and get them outdoors. This is one of the areas that we need to know more about. And I think next year, I'm going to add a question to the study that has to do with indoor riding to see if we can get a sense of how big, how big that is and whether people that are riding indoors are also riding outdoors, that kind of thing. There's way more questions than answers, but it's a pretty exciting potential opportunity for us. Oh, that's nice. Eric just Googled the name of the mountain bike kind of Zwift technology. It looks like it's, and I'm going to try to pronounce this, Sprintertainment, the name of the company? Does that look right?
Spinnertainment.
Spinnertainment, the name of the company that just recently released kind of indoor mountain biking technology. So we'll be watching all of that, with very curious minds.
And then one more, thanks for all of you who have stuck on here with us. Is there data to show the age groups who may be using e-bikes? And is there data to show the overall growth of e-bike use that plays into the overall number of people who choose to commute? I think that you answered that with the 70% rise from the MPD data.
Yeah, and that would be e-bike sales. And that's probably actually an underestimate, I should point out, because that Bicycle Product Suppliers Association data only looks at sort of bike dealers. Well, it's bike dealers and other channels, but what it doesn't include is e-bike specific dealers. And it looks like a big part of the volume of e-bikes right now is going through dealers that are e-bike specific. They don't sell other types of bikes, and that data are not included in the BPSA estimate. So I would actually guess that e-bike sales are increasing much more than that year over year. I mean, at some point they'll plateau. I mentioned that we did some work with Portland State on e-bike purchasers and what they're doing. And so there are some data in that study around the age groups, who's using them, why they're using them. It's not perfect, but it has some pretty interesting insights. It is publicly available. So if you Google, if there's a way for us to send out a link, we can do that. And I'm looking at Eric because I don't really know. But you can also just Google Portland State University and then put e-bike user survey. And I bet it will come right up and you can download it right off the Portland State University website. It's got some great demographic and usage information on e-bikes.
I will be adding that into our follow-up email with the recording. Easy.
Perfect.
And that was our last question. We want to thank you all so much for joining us and sticking around for an extra 7 minutes at the end of this. None of this work could be possible without our support of our coalition members. So please do consider becoming a member of PeopleForBikes if you aren't already, and encouraging your friends to do so as well. Thank you so much, and we will see you next month for our next industry webinar.
Thanks, everyone.